It's you in English, Anna Nichenko. Hello and welcome. And our guest is already online, Anna BRODSKY-KROTKINA, Washington and Lee University. Hello and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Today we will discuss relationships between US, NATO, elections and support of Ukraine. American society and the state continue to support Ukraine in fight against Russian aggression. Will something change after parliamentary elections this autumn? And what will change in this relationship in support and for US?
This is a very good question and a very important question, both for the US and for Ukraine. What's interesting about this election is that people who are supported by Trump tend to be not only ultra-conservative in social issues, but they're also ultra-conservative as far as Ukraine is concerned. Or better to say, they're rabid isolationists. In this case, a very, very interesting case of Ohio. This primary has already happened, and we know that as far as the candidate for the Republican Party winning, the person who won was someone whom Trump supported, and that was J.D. Vance. And J.D. Vance, he is of course a Republican, but he is a fairly extreme version of republicanism. One thing that is very dangerous is that he openly says that he doesn't care what happens to Ukraine. This is how he formulates it. I don't care what happens to Ukraine. He thinks that America should not be involved, and he thinks that ultimately America should just mind its own business and be completely isolated from the world. Now, it's hard to say what motivates him. He seems, frankly, fairly unprincipled. He might be indeed adhere to a fairly traditional stance of Republican isolationism. That's a fairly traditional conception of how America should handle itself. On the other hand, he actually has financial interests. For example, according to the AP press, he invested 300,000 of his money into the platform Rambler, and that platform actually works to support Russian propaganda channel Russia Today (RT). So. So it's interestingly intertwined ideological issues and at the same time issues of finance. Interestingly enough, his Democratic opponent in the same state of Ohio, Tim Ryan, not only is he a strong supporter of Ukraine, he's also considered by Russia to be a persona non grata, and Russia actually banned him from visiting Russia. Of course, he was quite ironic about it, and he said he's grateful to Putin for recognizing his good work in support of Ukraine. So that is Ohio. Let's look at today's election. In Wyoming, Liz Cheney is fighting with Harriet Hagerman. That is what's happening just as we speak. We don't yet know who will win. Liz Cheney was one of few Republicans, namely 10 Republicans, who voted to impeach Trump over the January 6th insurrection. Republican Party, who is very much Trump's party, absolutely despises her and did everything to undermine her position in the party. Now, her opponent, Harriet Hagerman, she has not mentioned Ukraine once. And this is quite interesting. They're both fighting for a place in the Senate. Does she not know about Ukraine? Could it be possible that she never heard of the war in Ukraine? Absolutely not. Where does she stand? She keeps it to herself. We can easily assume that if Trump supports her, she probably is also not in favor of supporting of Ukraine. And we see that pattern consistently. Trump supports, and mind you, Trump is right now a private citizen, but he still is very weighty in the party. Trump supports congressmen and who actually do not support Ukraine and are pro-Putin. An interesting case of Congressman Thomas Massey from Kentucky, for example. He downright wants to undermine NATO, just like Trump did. He thinks that he thinks that the United States of America should withdraw from NATO, and NATO in general should be dissolved. It was a wrong idea to keep NATO, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now Trump used to look at Thomas Massey with certain irony, and he didn't quite like him. After Massey began to express his anti-Ukrainian, pro-Putin positions, Trump changed his opinion and began to call him. In other words, what will be in store? What will happen during this election? We don't quite know. It looks like if the Trump's party wins, if there are more and more people in the Congress who were supported by Trump, the support for Ukraine might start waning. And the reason for it is, well, I can't comment on the corruption of the situation, but these are anti-democratic forces within the American government. So it's not accidental.
And what do you think, speaking about presidential elections, speaking about May candidates, and speaking about changes for relationship between U.S. and Russia, and also speaking about searches in Donald Trump residence? Trump, by the way, called it political persecution. What do you think about it?
Well, political future of Donald Trump right now is a bit iffy. And that's good news because we know his love of Putin. Not once did he criticize Vladimir Putin for anything. And right before the war, right before Putin waged this dirty, unprovoked war against Ukraine, Trump called him a genius. So the victory of Trump, should that happen, would be definitely bad news. But what would happen right now? The person who seems to be quite prominent on the political horizon of the Republican Party is Ron DeSantis, and that's the governor of Florida. Now, that's also a very dubious situation. He does not criticize Putin much, and moreover, he's financially involved with Russia. As it turned out, he invested $300 million of Florida pension funds in the Russian business. Of course, there was a public outcry. People were asking, pressuring him to withdraw, to divest from Russia. That didn't make much effect. Add to this that his own party, Republican Party, in Florida, also received $50,000 from Russian money via Parnas. If you remember such character, Lev Parnas, who was involved with Giuliani and some dirty business.
And also one more thing, we don't have so much time, and I'd like to discuss lots of questions. NATO strengthening. I mean, in European countries, how it destroys Moscow plans, and can Russian propaganda influence on this process?
Well, Russian propaganda, of course, has been fairly effective. But whom does it affect? It affects the poor, the disgruntled people, of course, who have financial troubles. We can see it's like with the Trump propaganda. We can see who is affected mostly by Trump's propaganda is people whose position in society is a little bit iffy, who is oftentimes working class, whose factories and plants have moved abroad. Putin's propaganda, like any propaganda, it appeals to emotions. Usually it appeals to the emotions of anger. It also appeals to people who are in search of the enemy, to someone to blame. That's how his propaganda works. And that's how it has been working in Russia. Ultimately, this he started his presidency by whipping up hatred for Chechens. Then there was massive hatred um, Georgians. Then there was hatred for gays. He still pushes that, and finally the hatred for Ukrainians was pushed. So that's propaganda that deals with hatred. When people are not happy about something, and he's very good at pushing the buttons, and they want to blame someone, his propaganda tends to find whom to blame. So can it be effective? Yes. Are there ways to resist it? Yes.
Now, also one more question. Russia tries now to find friends in global south. That's why Lavrov visited Africa. What are the next steps in relationship between Russia and Africa on the one hand, and between US and Africa on the other hand?
Well, it's a very good question, exactly related to propaganda. What's going on with Russia and propaganda? Russia puts 1% of the entire financial help that African countries receive. Only 1% of it comes from Russia. So what does Russia offer that is so attractive to many African countries? First of all, it exactly offers propaganda. It it offers propaganda that relates to the leaders. It offers disinformation campaign, and of course they sell arms. It's a very cheap way of addressing population in Africa, and it's entirely elite oriented. So again, it's very cheap. Russia is not doing anything to promote the well-being of African people, of African population. Um, but they are very good at reminding African about their colonial past, at mentioning American slavery, at kind of whipping up the old grievances. And the grievances are real, and they're there. But the Russians, as far as the propaganda is concerned, they're great historians. They want to keep the grievances alive and well, and very much in front of the people's eyes. Meanwhile, they're not offering anything but ultimately underhanded deals and dubious military presence. They're hiding behind Wagner Group. Uh, for example, in Mali, Russia certainly has an eye on cobalt, which is a very important element for batteries, for the phone batteries, for electric cars. So Russia has economic interest in this. And of course, it also wants to show its own population and the world that Russia is not entirely isolated. Does the collective West, try to counter it? Absolutely. There comes Blinken, who just visited South Africa a week ago. Macron went there. Samantha Power visited a couple of African countries, and they're trying to offer a counter narrative, pointing to the African countries that Russia is a huge colonial power, and what it's doing right now is basically it's waging the last colonial war in Europe. Will African people listen to this? That's a big question. West also offers financial help, and of course, Russia will not be in any position to aid Africa in the near future because its economy is shrinking, and it's not very large to begin with. It's the size of before the war. It was the size of Spain, but now, of course, the economy will be shrinking. So all they can offer is exactly propaganda, rhetoric, underhanded deals. And arms sales. We can only hope that the West will be persuasive enough.
By the way, 3 months ago, you said in our program that 85% Americans thought that Putin was a war criminal. What about the situation now?
It seems that the general sense has not disappeared almost every day. Even though Russian propaganda wants to tell people, and I can see that on Twitter and Facebook that Americans are not that interested in the war in Ukraine anymore. That is actually not true. Almost every day, with few exceptions, Ukrainian war is on the front page of major newspapers, Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post. It's by and large occupies the front page. Um, uh, there is a move and that's a bipartisan move to pronounce Russia to be a terrorist state, to give Russia the designation of a terrorist state. Uh, Curiously enough, the resistance comes from Anthony Blinken, who generally is very pro-Europe, very anti-Russia. But you can see he's an institutionalist, and you can see the logic of his resistance. He thinks, well, I will have to negotiate with them. This will preclude me from directly negotiating. This will burn the last bridge. In other words, if he's reluctant, it's not because he thinks that Russia is not a terrorist state, and it's not because of there is no pressure on him to do that. So the general sense is yes, Russia is a terrorist state, and Putin, yes, he's a killer.
Tell us, please, a little bit about life now in USA, according with the situation with Putin's price hike, as Biden said.
With Putin,
with Putin price hike, with the situation when lots of prices increased because of the war that Putin started in Ukraine.
This is exactly what Putin hopes that would destabilize the democratic government, and indeed Trump and his party will come to dominate. Is it possible? Is it really destabilizing the democratic government, the Democratic Party that is in charge right now? Truth be told, absolutely. It works against them because people do not see the clear-cut connection between the war in Ukraine and the sacrifices that they have to make. That is true. Conversely, Biden is doing everything to bring the prices down and to bring the price of oil down. And in fact, the price of oil is going down, down, down. So hopefully, the inflation is still very high. So hopefully, the price of oil will stabilize the situation. You have to realize the price of oil is very important for Americans because it's a huge country with, unfortunately, very poor public transportation. So people oftentimes they drive to work, they drive to do basic shopping, they drive to see a doctor. The price of oil is, it's not only reflected in the price of everything else, but it's something that people have to pay out of their pocket every single day just to get where they need to go. And that's a very large segment of American population. Of course, people who live in places like New York or Washington or Boston, they don't necessarily have to drive. But outside the big metropolises like that, people drive.
And have one more question, relationship Ukraine, India and USA. We know that Ukraine and India foreign ministers discussed strengthening cooperation and safety and role of India on the way to stop Russian aggression. Do you see this role?
The relationship with India and Russia, that's a very interesting relationship. First of all, this is one super traditional thing. India traditionally kind of had a minor love affair with Russia. Jawaharlal Nehru certainly had a soft spot for the Soviet government. And by the way, the American government of the time, like Truman, for example, he believed that Jawaharlal Nehru was a communist, whether he was a communist or not. So in a certain sense, the relationship between India and Russia, a good kind of a love affair relationship, it's somewhat traditional. Nonetheless, India was a developing democracy for a while. But then what happened in 2014 is that Modi took over, and suddenly, no, maybe not so suddenly, India made a turn towards an autocratic type rule. As in Russia, Modi crushed free press. He is controlling the courts, and he is pushing the idea of traditional Hindu values, ultimately oppressing and doing everything to oppress Muslim minority. In fact, stimulating violence against Muslim minority and stimulating hate against Muslim minority. So you can see very, very clear parallel between what Russia is doing and what Putin is doing and what Modi is doing. They're basically brothers in authoritarian faith. So their relationship, of course, you can say, well, it's realpolitik. You know, it's good for India right now, say, to buy oil at the discount prices, which they do hugely and incidentally, allegedly, then try to sell it to the United States, you know, hiding its origin. It's understandable. They are watching for their own interest. And that's on the level of on the economic level. But there is a level that ultimately is more important than the pocketbook, and that's the ideological level. And they're brothers in arms. So not surprising that Putin and Modi see eye to eye on things. And again, this is interestingly traditional. India, even though it was a developing democracy, never said anything against against Russia. Not when the Soviet Union invaded and crushed the revolution in Hungary, 1956. Not when it's invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968. Not when it started a horrible war in Afghanistan. India was always silent. So this is a kind of a traditional situation. In the way India's development sort of accommodates, India's politics accommodates all sorts of misbehaviors. First, the Soviet misbehavior, and now the misbehavior of the Russian Federation.
Anna, thank you for all your explanations and that today you joined our program. Thanks a lot. Anna BRODSKY-KROTKINA, Washington and Lee University was online with us. It was UAN English, Anna Nichenko. See you.